Slightly delayed edition of the Fast Moving Ghost Caboose. Welcome, one and all, and great to see you at the back. It's to enter the world of John Southworth, Fools and Jesters at the English Court. Wonderful history book about the role of this fascinating figure in all courts in all parts of the world, which we find in a sort of universal aspects of kingly domination, mostly kingly. And to start today's reading, I'm going to read the blurb on the side of the book here, and it is as follows. Clowns, fools, comedians of one kind or another have been a feature of virtually every recorded culture in the history of civilization and made significant contributions to the development of early theatre and literary drama. This is certainly true of Western European culture, and nowhere more so than in England, where the fool in various guises is found at the heart of popular dramatic activity from its earliest recorded beginnings. So this is Fools and Jesters only at the English court. There's some mention of the Italian and French courts in this book, but he restricts himself to a lot of Tudor and Plantagenet England. The focus of this book is a particular type of fool, the court or king's fool, separated from the others by the special relationship he enjoyed with the king or ruler as his personal retainer. The author draws on contemporary sources to present a unique reign-by-reign chronicle of the English court fool from his origins in Carolingian Europe and Celtic Ireland to Archie Armstrong, jester to James I. Among the topics covered are the innocents or natural fools, the evolution of the Tudor jester from his medieval antecedents, the fool's motley or customary wear, and biographies of Henry VIII's fool Will Somer or Sommer, and Shakespeare's player fools Will Kemp and Robert Armin. Richly illustrated in colour and black and white, Fools and Jesters at the English Court throws new light on a subject which spans social and cultural history. All those interested in theatrical history and in the origins of an abiding aspect of popular culture will find this a fascinating and revealing book. So John Southworth himself, the author, was an actor and a director in the theatre. He wrote about the early history of popular entertainment, and he's got to be a good guy because he worked in Ipswich. Don't ask me why. I mean, a part of England where the two rival football teams have a derby called the Old Farm Derby. How good is that? It's only funny if you know about Scottish football. So, Roy Bosch today. Let's get going. Chapter 1, King and Fool. And today I've fastened my watch to the microphone. I really like the sound. Okay. Chapter 1, King and Fool. Let me just adjust myself here. Clowns, fools, comedians of one kind or another have been a feature of virtually every recorded culture in the history of civilization and have made significant contributions to the development of early theatre and literary drama. Excuse me. This is certainly true of Western European culture, and nowhere more so than in England, where the fool in various disguises is found at the heart of popular dramatic activity from its earliest recorded beginnings. The history of the fool in that more general sense makes a fascinating story that has already been told and will remain in the background of all that follows. But my subject here is with a particular type of fool, separated from others by the special relationship that he enjoyed with king or ruler as his personal retainer. He commonly goes by the name of Jester, though that is a term that in its present usage dates only from the Tudor period. I shall call him simply a court or king's fool. In some of the earliest European records, he is designated nebulo. Nebulo, in other words, fog or mist. Someone can be nebulous, for example, or something can be nebulous, can be vague. A word, nebulo, in Latin, a word expressive of clerical contempt. In other words, the priests looked down on the fool, called them the mist, the fog, but which nevertheless conveys an accurate assessment of his social standing. He was seen as a paltry, worthless fellow, a nobody. It was not merely that his position in the feudal hierarchy was low. Like the minstrels, he was altogether excluded from it. The manner of the fool's exclusion is what's really, really interesting, because it wasn't typical in any way. It wasn't banishment. It was a sort of semi-permeable inclusion. A bit like how, of course, contemporary, it was in the body, but it wasn't allowed to be really part of the body for a endless period. It was not merely that his position in the feudal hierarchy was low. Like the minstrels, so the performers, he was altogether excluded from it. Being neither lord nor cleric, freeman nor serf, he existed in a social limbo. Even in his natural habitat of the court, he remained apart, almost as if he belonged to another species. In this, his situation was more extreme than that of the minstrels. Though obliged to sit at a separate table when not performing, they at least, the minstrels, the performers, they at least had the companionship of their fellows. They had each other. He was alone in his separation. So the fool wasn't allowed to sit with, of course, the king. The fool wasn't allowed to sit with the other performers. He floated. In 15th century scenes of court life, he occupies otherwise empty scenes, or is shown flitting from one group of courtiers to another, a barely corporeal experience. It was only in relation to his master that he was able to gain identity. By definition, he was someone on whom the king could bestow his favour without giving rise to any of the jealousies or counterclaims on the part of competing court factions that normally accompanied the exercise of royal patronage. Indeed, his office was a gift of the dubious kind that few would regard as a favour at all. It was one that none but he hath wit can perform, and none but he that wants wit will perform. That's a quote from Thomas Fuller, The Holy State and the Profane State from 1642. I have to sort of unravel that a little bit. I'll say it again. It is a task that none but he that hath wit can perform, and none but he that wants wit will perform. So, if you have wit to do it, you won't do it. And if you don't have wit to do it, you will do it. And whatever position at court the fool might obtain through a successful performance of his role over a period of time, he remained wholly and permanently dependent on that favour. It could be withdrawn at any time, and frequently was. And when that happened, he could usually be relied upon to disappear from the scene as though he never existed. Yet, for as long as it lasted, the bond between the king and himself might be close, even intimate, and in those circumstances he could come to have a real, if incalculable, influence on his master's policy and decisions. Again, the fool's nebulous status at court enabled him to act on occasion as confidential informant or spy. as the fool Gaulet is said to have done for William of Normandy, warning him of the approach of intending assassins and thus saving the future conqueror's life. William the Conqueror, that is, 1066. It is the source and precondition of whatever freedom of action he enjoyed. We now tend to picture the court fool, the traditional jester in cap and bells, as belonging in a special way to the Middle Ages and to Western European culture. But his origins, though hidden in unrecorded antiquity, may be as old as kingship itself. For whatever forceful and ambitious men or women have attained a position of autocratic power over others, there is often found at their side an insignificant person of obscure origins, who, whether given the formal title of fool or not, is seen to fulfill an equivalent function. The obscure origin of the fool is what gives the fool his own protection, because he is not perceived to be a threat. The trickster figure that anthropologists have identified in myths and legends across a wide range of early cultures as chaos maker and sower of discord, who at the same time is able to win boons for mankind from creator gods, is here bound and contained in a mutually advantageous partnership with tribal chieftain or king, advantageous to the ruler because it provided him with necessary recreation for putting aside the rituals and prerogatives of kingship in simple enjoyment of the humour and companionship of a fellow human being who carried no weight of social and political debt, advantageous to the fool because it gave him a privileged haven for the practice of his eccentric skills for so long as he could keep his patron amused and retain his interest. And retain his interest. In the course of its long history, the partnership was to take a variety of forms. In what follows, I focus on English records from the medieval, Tudor and Jacobean periods, but that it was known to much earlier cultures is evidenced by writings from ancient Egypt, the historical records of Sima Chen, father of Chinese historiography, and by the classical Celtic and Islamic texts that Enid Welsford drew upon in her more general account of the fool's history. It sounds like a dull paragraph. It's quite important that the fool is present, according to the author John Southworth. The fool is present in all cultures, in all elements of kingship you see across the world. But he's only focusing on the English court. But it is fascinating. You could call it an archetype that we see it in Egypt. We see it in Celtic and Islamic cultures. We see it in Chinese cultures. And never mind that, just within one country, you see it in the Jacobean period, the Tudor period, Plantagenet period. Sorry about my voice. I don't know what's going on. The curious double act of king and fool, master and servant, substance and shadow, may thus be seen as a universal, symbolic expression of the antithesis lying at the heart of the autocratic state between the forces of order and disorder, of structured authority and incipient anarchy, in which the conditional nature of the fool's license, so far but no further, gives reassurance that ultimately order will always prevail. The fool, though constrained, continuously threatens to break free in pushing to its limits whatever freedom he is given. He is the trickster of myth in a historical straitjacket from which he is forever struggling to escape. And if the king, as the dominant partner, sets the tone of their exchanges and the fool has everything to gain from a willing acceptance of his subservient role, his participation can never be forced. If, for whatever reason, he should come to feel that his master has reneged on the unwritten contract between them, the rules of the game, it is always open to him to refuse to play, however costly to himself the refusal might prove to be. He thus retains, and needs to retain, if he is to achieve the full potential of his role, a degree of independence. Like the actor on stage, in a live performance, success is inevitably accompanied by the possibility of failure. And the higher the stakes that are played for, the greater the possible failure. It is only the successful fool who lives on in the in the remembrance of later generations to find his way into the jest books. The sycophantic, flattering fool produces an inferior type of humour and is soon forgotten. Those who take too high a risk and fail in the attempt face a grimmer fate in prison or madhouse. So the fools that are way too obliging to the king, the fools that are sort of brown-nosing the king, being sycophantic, those are the fools who don't perform their function, who don't perform their job properly. It is built into the role of the fool to be rude to the king, to push the traditional relationship further. It's like the pruning of the king. Ironically, however, the subversion only fulfills the king's position and sustains the dominance of the king, and in fact even builds the king's dominance. So there's an innate cannibalizing of the king's power that actually helps the muscle fibers of the king to grow infinitely. But there was danger on both sides of this balancing act. If the fool risked going too far in his banter and tricks, the king was also vulnerable to the fool's abuse of the license he was given. In the case of a foolish king and an unscrupulous fool, the danger could be very real. The classic example here is that of the 11th century Byzantine fool, Romanus Boilus, who exploited the privileged position he had gained at court to plot against the life of his patron, the Emperor Constantine IX. Romanus had fallen in love with the emperor's mistress and aimed not only to eliminate his rival, but to take over his throne. According to a contemporary historian, he came within an ace of success. In medieval psalters, so psalters are books that just contain the Psalms. It's very popular, I believe, with the so-called New Christians of Portugal, in other words, the converted Jews, for obvious reasons. In medieval psalters, Psalm 52, beginning, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God," was usually illustrated by a depiction of King David the psalmist in company with his fool, or more rarely, the suicide of Saul. Saul is the biblical figure who, on learning of the approach of soldiers, falls into his sword, or falls onto his sword. He kills himself by stabbing himself. In the 14th century Barlow Psalter, these two subjects are juxtaposed in a telling image of the potentially destructive power of the fool as perceived by clerics. Again, it's the churchmen who cast disdain onto the fools. These two subjects are juxtaposed in a telling image of destructive power of the fool as perceived by clerics. The fool's bladder stick mimics the thrust of Saul's directed sword. The bladder stick, as far as I can work out, was a pig's bladder attached to a stick, and you can see it in this depiction. I know I'm really bad at doing this camera thing. I'm going to do my best here. I can't see what's going on, but here we go. So you've got the fool at the bottom with a deflated sort of bladder on top of a stick, and it's withered. Think of the Looney Tunes thing where a flower withers when it sees something horrible. And Saul is the fool, I guess, or is compared to the fool, and the fool is compared to Saul. And he is depicted above stabbing himself. So there seems to be something inherently self-destructive in a fool's behaviour. A kind of encoded series of gestures by a jester to reaffirm the status of the king. Also a component to check the power of a king. It is in the infinitely varied nuances of the relationship between king and fool and the widely differing tone of their exchanges that the greatest interest may be found to lie. At one extreme, the fool, in St. Chrysostom's definition, At one extreme, the fool, in St. Chrysostom's definition, he who gets slapped, is more or less complicit, but is a more or less complicit but in the low but universal comedy of the banana skin and the custard pie. At the other, their partnership may be so close as to allow an identification, even a voluntary exchange of roles, in which the fool becomes an alter ego of the king, and the king assumes his fool's identity in religious ritual or actual combat. We shall encounter instances of both. Can you imagine how boring it is to be king? You've got this one role to perform, and you have to be it 24/7. Something I quite admire in kings. They never chose, or monarchs in general, they never chose to do what they did, and it's where they carry their office that I think it could be seen as admirable. So it could be profoundly relieving for a monarch to not bother to be a monarch for a bit. Just being flashed with something here. It might be really an escape. The fool provides escapism for kings. Okay. So remember that the fool could become the alter ego of the king and replace the king in commanding, however theatrically or temporarily. But it is remarkable that in nearly all medieval illustrations of the court fool that have survived, he is represented as armed with a weapon: club, marotte, a stick with a miniature fool's head at the top, bladder, dagger, or sword. It's first of many mentions of bladder and a bladder stick. If you type in bladder stick in Google, you will be presented with dog treats, those treats that dogs have to get away all the crap out of their teeth. And I can't find anything of an actual stick. What I can find, thanks to Wikipedia, which I will always advocate the use of, it had many uses, a pig's bladder, as a hollow organ. It had various applications in medicine, in traditional cuisines and customs, and of course I'm reading from the pig bladder entrance in Wikipedia. Historically, the pig bladder had several additional uses, all based on its properties as a lightweight, stretchable container that could be filled and tied off. Had traditional ceremonial uses in Europe. It's still used during Fasching, the sort of carnival celebrations in Bad Aussee, if I mispronounced that. Similarly, in Shinzot de Limia, or Limia in Spain, inflated pig bladders are carried during carnival. Schlachtfest in Germany, hanging the pig's bladder in front of the host entertainment establishment. But the interesting thing, it was used in football, in manufacturing rugby balls, and in mob football, the sort of predecessor to today's football. And here's the cool thing: for centuries before the invention of the paint tube, artists used to store their paints in pig bladders. When the artist was ready to use the paint, they would puncture a hole in the bladder and squeeze out the desired amount of paint. They would have to mend the hole when finished, and the whole process was quite messy. The club may be padded, and the dagger or sword, like that of the Roman actor, made only of wood, but the hint of aggression, or at least of preparedness for an active defence, remains. We have, of course, the image to mind of the staff or the wand or the baton in the tarot sort of imagery. The coxcomb is the man who has been cheated on by his wife. The coxcomb, familiar in Renaissance art and literature as an emblematic badge of fools and of folly, gives warning of similar assertiveness. The madman fool of the mentally unstable Charles VI of France was named Ancelin Coq. At this point, however, it is necessary to make a basic distinction between two broad categories of fool, between the natural and the artificial, those who were regarded as fools by nature, and those who pretended folly to fulfill a professional comedic role. It is a distinction that in Europe was understood and applied from as early as the 12th century, but in a wider context goes back to the earliest recorded beginnings of the fool's history. So right at the beginning, right at the start of the cultural understanding of the fool, was this distinction between the natural and the artificial fool. And this is even displayed in the tarot today. We have the image of a fool as sort of dominant and powerful. We also have the fool as potentially mentally retarded, and it's always ambiguous. People I do tarot with will be no stranger to the fact that I do not like the Aleister Crowley deck. I've sat with the cards, believe me, but it doesn't sing to me at all. And I think it's a big mistake that it's called the madman, o louco, or louco. I don't know how to pronounce that properly in Portuguese, but the fool is presented as the madman, the crazy guy. But bizarrely, it has this kind of strange self-determination, which isn't so present in other depictions of the fool. There's an idea of all limbs outstretched, some kind of very masculine dominance. That's how I perceive the card. Of course, I don't want to trample on anyone else's appreciation of that card. It just doesn't give me any music at all. Then we have from the Swiss deck, one of the Swiss decks, a strange vibrance to the eyes of the fool, looking very much like a jester now, less self-determined, with legs crossed. One of the feet appears to be moving or in movement, but there's a slight twist in the eyes which might suggest mental slowness, so to speak. And to me, that back to why I love the Marseille Tarot so much, is the ambiguity, the story that it allows you to tell. So the fool is not just maybe ambiguous, but is very three-dimensional to me here. The look in the eye could be many things. Could be wishful thinking, could be eyes burnt by the sun, could be being led by a higher calling, could be just sheer and pure determination. Yet you have a lack of acknowledgement of what's really going on. A tear in the shorts, and the dog or the wolf, whatever that animal is, trying to tear down the fabric, the dignity of this fool. there seems to be a bizarre balance between the determination in the face and the humility provided by the dog clawing off his shorts. Excuse me. And then, as much as I love very much the Rider-Waite-Smith deck from the early 20th century, this again gives you a much more, almost like a humanist idea of the fool. The fool is the determiner of his fate. Splendid, antique, but self-determining, which the fool should always be on that line of doubt. Can we really ever know if the fool knows what he is doing? This also seems to sort of push out possible interpretations by showing such lack of ambiguity, in my opinion. Again, if you really love these cards and if it's really your deck, I'm determined to not stop you enjoying it. But this is my heartfelt reaction to these cards. So again, that distinction: natural fool and artificial fool, potentially mentally retarded fool, and a fool that's even cleverer than the king. A natural and artificial one: those who were regarded as fools by nature, and those who pretended folly or foolishness to fulfill a professional comedic role. It is a distinction that in Europe was understood and applied from as early as the 12th century, but in a wider context goes back to the earliest recorded beginnings of the fool's history. A subdivision of the first of these categories, the natural or innocents, as they were called, the innocent fools, as I prefer to term them, should be made between the madman fools who were congenitally or spasmodically insane, and those who would now be described in politically incorrect but plain language as slow-witted or mentally retarded. So you've got either hysterical, psychotic fools who could be considered as madmen, congenitally or spasmodically insane, and you have the so-called slow-witted and mentally retarded fools. So there seems to be people with an extremity of something, receiving too much of something, too much of sort of divine inspiration, as the insane were often interpreted as being. And you've got people who were understood to be defective, slow, disabled. Again, these are not my words, this is words used or attributed to them. Of the latter group, so the mentally retarded, the slow-witted, a few rare individuals, of whom Will Sommer, the fool of Henry VIII, was a notable exemplar, might be further distinguished as wise innocents. Wise innocents. Innocence as a noun, a noun for a person. So it's innocent with a T at the end, not a C and an E. The relations that these several categories of fool normally enjoyed with their patrons naturally differed from each other greatly, as did the costume and props with which each was associated in succeeding periods. In later pages, I have detailed information to offer on the complex subject of costume, and this will be summarized in a concluding chapter. But to illustrate the distinctions that were made between the clever and the innocent, the mad and the simple, it may be useful here to pursue a little further the related matter of their weapons, as these were depicted in contemporary psalters. The weapons were, of course, symbolic. This will enable me to indicate the plan of my subsequent chapters, in which their histories, insofar as these have required separate treatment, are told. In the medieval Latin word for fool, follis, had the original classical meaning of a leathern sack or air-filled bag, hence the bladders or baubles of the innocents. Baubles, see a huge feature in the Marseille deck of Jodorowsky, the baubles, the balls that you hang, we hang them on Christmas trees, in England at least, decorative features that sometimes make ringing bell sounds. Such visual clues to their identity would have been essential to illiterate lay users of the Psalters. So the Psalters probably had images in them. Of course, Psalter is the book of the Psalms, book of Psalms, used for singing, used for recitation. So probably they would have had books in them, very useful for illiterate people to sort of feel included. That's my understanding of it. But the phallic suggestiveness of the clubs and branches of wood wielded by the clever or counterfeit fools carried an additional or more ominous message. Not only were these elegantly dressed figures to be identified as fools, a fact not otherwise apparent in their appearance, they were to be regarded by the layman as fools of an essentially dangerous kind. They are unlikely to have been drawn from life. The artists who painted them were not so much concerned with individual fools as in making a general admonitory point about the wickedness and folly of the secular world of their time, and in warning of its moral dangers. So a token of sin and waywardness would be a fool, but a fool, as was commonly understood in the court, was neutral, wasn't necessarily a negative word. You fool. Well, you get my point. It was more neutral than it was today. In the Edwin of Canterbury Psalter of 1147, which derives from an Utrecht original of 9th century date, the situation described in Psalm 52, and here's to read. Psalm 52, God is looking down from heaven at the sons of men. All have turned aside, all alike are tainted. So this is the Hebrew Bible, which is discussing fools many thousands of years ago, is a given literal interpretation. They're just recited. Here, the fool appears as an evil prince installed on a dais. A dais is like a platform, surveying with evident complacency a scene of universal disorder, rapine, and slaughter. A sword rests in readiness across his lap, while above the figure of Christ appeals in vain for peace to be restored. We know, however, that fools of the mentally competent kind existed from an early date and were often armed with real weapons. For these we shall look first in Chapter 3 to Ireland, where a unique body of oral law comprising praise poetry, annals of pseudo-historical myths and legends, survived the coming of Christianity to provide what one distinguished scholar has described as a window on the Iron Age. In this Irish Celtic tradition, kings were little more than tribal chieftains in constantly shifting warfare with their rivals, and the fools who were said to have accompanied them were expected to take an equal share in the fighting with their lord's other attendants. The Riogdruth, or the Riogdrut, king's fool, was thus required to combine the gift of eliciting laughter with prowess as a warrior. His aggressive potential was fully absorbed in defence of his lord and the defeat of his enemies. Norman joculatoris, literally jokers, are also found to have been active on the field of battle, and one of them, this is so hard to pronounce, Taillefer, is credited with initiating the decisive charge of the French cavalry at Hastings and decapitating an opponent. The Battle of Hastings, 1066, huge date for the beginnings of the English Empire, or the English monarchs. It is only with his domestication in the more settled courts of the Angevin and Plantagenet kings that the clever fool forfeits his right to carry arms. It is a process whereby the joculator, along with his old companions, the wandering mimi et histriones of early Latin documents, histrionics, dramatic behaviour, takes shelter under the new umbrella term of menestrel in its original meaning of little servant. Menestrel, minstrel, meaning little servant originally. Combining a talent to amuse with utilitarian skills of a huntsman, wayfarer, or messenger. The definition of a fool is entirely given by the court. The fool doesn't determine themselves in relation to the wider world. It is the court that calls them the servant. A servant to them, to the court, or to it. Costume change. Thank you. In the 13th century, he is given the title of Magister, a horse to ride and a servant to attend him at the king's expense, and may be rewarded with a plot of land to cultivate on his retirement. We are not deceived by such royal favours. The Celtic chieftain, when he realises that his defeated opponent in personal combat is not the kingly rival he had taken him to be, but merely his rival's double, with the shameful haircut of a fool under his crown, feels insulted and disgraced. To medieval clerics, especially the king's chaplains, the presence of such people at court was never less than an embarrassing nuisance. So again, it's the priests who do not look favourably on the fools. I think probably they felt threatened. The role of the confessor was not to confess. The confessor was the priest who would listen to the king's confessions. The exclusive access to the king upset, literally overturned, by the presence of a fool who also had that privileged access. It was against that continuing social and religious prejudice that the fool was to achieve his modest apotheosis as Mr. Nobody. The fool does not really have a number, or it does have a number, but it's the number 0, which could be seen as not an actual number. It's not an integer. Or is it? It's a mysterious presence in numerical terms, in the very least. Mr. Nobody. His subsequent history, culminating in his emancipation as itinerant entertainer and stage fool, will be traced in chapters 9 to 11 and 13 to 15. So, the hefty clubs and marottes carried by the Salter fools of disordered mind were in part representative of the threats that the fool of the psalm, who says in his heart, "There is no God," according to the psalm, was seen to pose to the people of God. Excuse me. So the fools have always posed a threat in biblical accounts, at least according to John Southworth. But their weapons were not merely emblematic in kind. Though rare at the English court, frantic fools, as they were termed in the Middle Ages, made regular appearances at the court of France. The madman Cibelot, armed with a marotte, is said to have attacked on sight everyone he encountered at the court of Henri III, with the sole exception of the king himself, whom a marvellous instinct obliged him to respect, though doubtless contained to tolerable limits by the restraining hands of their keepers. Such fools come closest in character to the anarchic tricksters of myth. The sticks and bladders of those fools who were accounted simple rather than mad were probably used as much for defence as attack. For the closer the bond between king and fool, and with the innocents this might reach to mutual affection, the more the fool was resented by other court servants. However, Master Guillaume, a 17th century Mantuan fool, Mantua in North Italy, in Lombardy, I think, Master Guillaume, a 17th century Mantuan fool, was described as a mortal enemy to pages and lackeys, and as carrying under his coat a short stick, which he called his bird, and when he beat them he was always the first that cried out murder. The stubborn little fellow is shown in one of the depictions here in the book. I'm not going to actually show it, with cudgel resting conveniently on his shoulder. Cudgel is a small stick. Is given a not is giving as good as he gets in his argument with David. A near naked fool from another psalter carries what appears to be a dagger or sharpened stick in one hand and a large wafer in the other. The Taj, or small shield, brought by Edward II for one of his innocents called Robert, was probably for a play fight of some kind, and was certainly the cardboard armour with which Will Somer was equipped for the Christmas revels of 1551. The mock combat was to be a popular turn in the repertoire of English court fools, both innocent and clever, throughout their history. I have said that the king-fool relationship was advantageous to the kingly patron in that it provided him with recreation and the companionship of a person with whom he could establish rapport at the basic level of one human being to another. But there was always something more to it than that. A medieval bishop is reported to have said on the occasion of his election, "I have heard the truth for the last time." For the more powerful men become, the more isolated they tend to be, as their channels of communication with the real world outside the artificial ambience of the court are progressively impeded by the desire of their courtiers to please. To tell them what they like to hear rather than what they need to know. The words of a man who is made bishop, "I have heard the truth for the last time." People will just say what you want. Yes men will surround you. The king's need for truth, especially of the unpalatable kind, and the fool's ability to communicate it in a uniquely acceptable form as humour, was a crucial factor in the relations between them, from which the fool derived much of his raison d'être. Part of the fascination of Shakespeare's handling of the king-fool relationship in King Lear lies in his reversal of what is often thought to be the typical slapping order, in which the king becomes a target for the fool's truth-bearing shafts. Far from distracting Lear from his grief, as is sometimes supposed, their effect is to confront him with the unbearable reality of the situation in which he finds himself, a painful but necessary stage in his progress to self-knowledge and ultimate redemption. Shakespeare's dramatic treatment of this theme is wholly in accord with an ancient historical tradition. The innocent speaks the truth because he can do no other. He blurts it out, and, more often than not, escapes retribution because of his transparent honesty. It was not so much for his folly as for his wisdom, that special gift he possessed for hitting the nail of truth on the head, that the innocent was so greatly valued in the medieval and Tudor periods. As Cardinal Perron said of Master Guillaume, he lives, or should say Perron said of Master Guillaume, he lives of a profession he does not understand. The clever fool understands only too well the tricks he is taking in the communication of hard truths, and is obliged to adopt more subtle approaches. He is most effective and funny when he contrives to hold a mirror to the king, in which his patron can see a magnified image of his own attitudes and decisions, and recognise for himself the folly in them. In the old legend, when Zeus announces in the busy marketplace of the world that he will send down a torrent of rain, but that only fools will be wetted by it, it is the one wise man there who hurries indoors to fetch an umbrella. When the rain descends and he alone remains dry, the others turn upon him in fury. In a world of fools, it is the person who realizes, or who can be brought to realize, his own innate folly, who is truly wise. This is the universal message of the clever fool. When the second emperor of Qin, 209-207 BC, proclaimed his intention to lacquer the Great Wall of China, so to paint lacquer across or over the whole wall of China, the Great Wall of China, his councillors stood speechless, appalled by the economic and human cost of the project, but too cowed to express opposition. According to Sima Chan, in his historical records, it required the intervention of a fool named Twisty Pole to deflect the emperor's purpose, and he did it, not by contradiction, but by a show of agreement. That's a splendid idea, the fool promptly enthused. Lacquer the great wall all smooth and shiny, then it will be too slippy for any invaders to climb over it. Now let's get down to the practical side of the job. The lacquering is easy enough, but building a drying room may present a problem or two. A long, tense silence ensued. Then, as the penny dropped, a slow smile was seen to spread over the emperor's face. The bizarre, impossible project was buried in laughter. In a court dominated by fear and hypocrisy, as many were, it might be necessary for truth to be represented as folly in order to be heard. When no one at the French court of Philip VI was brave enough to inform the king that most of his fleet had been destroyed by Edward III at Sluis in 1340, it was left to an unnamed fool to break the news. Entering the royal presence, he was heard to mutter, "Those cowardly Englishmen, those chicken-hearted Britons." "How so?" Philip asked. "Well, because they had not courage enough. They had not courage enough to jump into the sea like your own sailors, who went headlong from their ships, leaving them to the enemy who did not dare to follow them." As Erasmus was to claim of the Renaissance fools of his time, quote, "They can speak truth and even open insults, and be heard with positive pleasure. Indeed, the words that would cost a wise man his life are surprisingly enjoyable when uttered by a clown. For truth has a genuine power to please if it manages not to give offence, but this is something the gods have granted only to fools." End quote. Humour consists essentially in a surprising juxtaposition of opposites. As Thomas Fuller said in the 17th century, it is unnatural to laugh at a natural, but we may smile and be touched by his wisdom because, like that of the child, it is unpredictable and goes so often to the heart of truth. We laugh at the assumed folly of the clever fool or comedian because we see in it a reflection of our own foolish attitudes and behaviour. To finish today, humour has been described as potentially one of the finest forms of thought and perception. It is a human necessity. The delicate and often dangerous task of the court fools was to supply that humour in the place where, for the greater part of our history, it was most needed. The centre and hub of supreme political power, the court of the king. As that power was gradually eroded and finally lost, so the fools were to take their departure or be excluded to other, more promising fields of activity. The humour with which they had humanised the courts of the king in the days of his power, being mainly of the spontaneous kind, dependent on personal idiosyncrasy and the mood of the moment, can never be wholly recaptured. But the fools themselves, though accounted nobodies in their own time, surely deserve rescue from the distortions or complete oblivion into which so many have fallen. This I attempt in the pages that follow. The project of addressing the fool as part of the king's court and part of our human universal culture is one of restoration and celebration.